The scent of incense and machine oil still clings to my robes when I close my eyes, though I haven't worn them in 300 years. My name is Valdor Kesh, and I was once a historitor of the Imperial Palace, granted access to archives that would burn the minds of lesser men. I saw something in the depths beneath the throne room, something that made the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes himself bar the way and swear me to silence with oaths that bound my very soul. You think the Custodes, those golden demigods who stand eternal vigil over the Emperor, see everything. You think their 10,000 years of service means they know all his secrets. They don't. There are chambers in the Imperial Palace where even the 10,000 cannot tread. Vaults sealed by the Emperor's own hand before the heresy, before the throne, before everything went wrong. What I'm about to tell you is why those seals must never break. Chapter 1. The Archive of Forbidden Hours. I entered the service of the Imperial Palace on the first day of my 200th year, young by the standards of the administratum, but already ancient compared to the short-lived masses of humanity. The rejuvenate treatments had taken well, and my mind remained sharp enough to pass the 17 examinations required for assignment to the Hall of Remembrance, where the history of the Imperium was catalogued, preserved, and carefully edited for public consumption. The hall itself was a cathedral of knowledge, its vaulted ceilings disappearing into shadows that never quite touched the perpetual glow globes. 60,000 data servitors lined the walls, their withered faces locked in permanent expressions of concentration as they processed endless streams of information. The smell was always the same: old parchment, ozone from the cogitator banks, and underneath it all, the faint metallic tang of the servitors' nutrient feeds. My mentor was a woman named Hester Vane, a senior historitor who had served for 6 centuries. Her face was a web of fine lines that rejuvenate could no longer smooth, and her eyes held the peculiar weariness of someone who had learned too much truth and learned to carry it silently. The first rule, she told me on that first day, leading me through aisles of ancient texts bound in materials I couldn't identify, is that history serves the Imperium, not the other way around. You will learn things that contradict the official records. You will discover that heroes were cowards, that victories were massacres, that the Golden Age was built on mountains of corpses. You will document these truths faithfully in the deep archives, and you will never speak of them outside these walls. I nodded, believing I understood. I didn't. The Hall of Remembrance occupied 17 levels of the Imperial Palace, but everyone knew there were deeper archives, older repositories that descended into the very bones of the structure. These were not spoken of openly. When I asked about them, Hester's face became a mask. "There are things below," she said simply. "Things from before the heresy, things from the Unification Wars, even earlier. You are not ready. Most never are." The work itself was meticulous and consuming. I spent decades learning the proper techniques for preserving documents that had survived the long night, the age of strife, conflicts whose names had been forgotten by everyone except those of us who kept the records. I learned to read languages that had been dead for millennia, to interpret symbols from human cultures that had evolved in isolation on colony worlds and then been reabsorbed into the Imperium. I learned which truths could be told and which must be buried. There were 14 other historitors of my rank in the hall, and we developed a strange camaraderie born of shared secrets. We would meet in the refectory levels, eating bland but nutritious food while carefully not discussing our work. But sometimes, late in our shifts when exhaustion loosened tongues, someone would mention something they'd found. A record of the Emperor walking among humanity in ancient times under different names. Evidence of Xenos civilizations the Imperium had completely eradicated and then erased from memory. Accounts of imperial victories that had only been won through unspeakable sacrifices. The Adeptus Custodes were a constant presence, though they moved through the archives like golden ghosts. They never spoke to us unless necessary, but you could feel their awareness, their absolute attention. Once, I turned a corner and nearly collided with one of the 10,000. He was massive, his armor gleaming even in the dim light, his face hidden behind a helm that seemed to look through me rather than at me. He stood aside without a word, and I hurried past, feeling my insignificance like a physical weight. Years became decades. I proved myself worthy of higher clearances, deeper access. I was allowed into Sub-Level 8, where documents from the Great Crusade were stored. Not the triumphant records available to the public, but the real accounts. The costs, the failures, the Legion's excesses before the heresy revealed their true extent. I read Remembrancer accounts that had been suppressed, descriptions of what the Space Marine Legions had really done to bring worlds into compliance. I learned about the Rangdan Xenocides, where entire legions had been devastated fighting something so terrible that all records had been sealed. I discovered that the Emperor's plan for humanity had always included lies, necessary deceptions to hold the Imperium together. I thought I was becoming numb to revelation, hardened by exposure to uncomfortable truths. I thought I understood the architecture of secrets that held the Imperium together. Then, one day in my 340th year of service, Hester came to me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It was fear, but also something like anticipation, or perhaps resignation. "You've been selected," she said quietly. "The Sigillite seal has been broken on Archive 13. They need someone to catalogue what's inside. You have the necessary clearances, and the Captain General has approved your name specifically." My hands went cold. Archive 13 was legend among the Historitors, mentioned only in whispers. It was said to contain records from before the Emperor took the throne, from the final days of the Unification Wars, when Terra had been scarred and broken, but finally whole. Some said it held the Emperor's own journals. Others claimed it contained records of the beings he had bargained with to gain his power. "Why me?" I managed to ask. Hester looked at me with those ancient, weary eyes. "Because you're young enough to survive what you'll learn, and old enough to keep silent about it. And because..." She paused, choosing words carefully. "There are deeper archives still. If you prove worthy with 13, there are doors that might open for you. Doors that should remain closed, but the Administratum, in its infinite bureaucracy, requires someone to verify that what lies behind them should stay hidden." She handed me a data slate with my new orders, sealed with marks I had only seen in theoretical documents about Imperial authority structures. The Sigillite's own seal, though the Sigillite had been dead for 10,000 years. Beneath it, a mark I didn't recognize, a spiral within a star within a circle. "Report to Sub-Level 15, Section Omega, at the start of next shift," Hester said. "There will be Custodians waiting. They'll take you the rest of the way down. Valdor, be careful. Some knowledge changes you. Some knowledge..." She trailed off, then simply said, "Come back to us when you can." I spent that evening in my quarters, staring at the data slate. Sub-Level 15 was as deep as I had ever been told the archives went. Section Omega didn't appear on any map I had access to, and the fact that Custodians, multiple, would be escorting me suggested that whatever lay ahead required security that even they considered necessary. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I reviewed everything I knew about the Imperial Palace's structure, trying to understand where I was being sent. The palace was vast beyond comprehension, a city mountain that had been built and rebuilt countless times. Its depths descended into layers of history like geological strata. Each war, each renovation, each expansion leaving its mark. How deep did it really go? And what had the Emperor hidden in those depths that even his Custodes were not meant to see? When I reported the next day, 2 Custodians were indeed waiting. They stood like golden statues at the entrance to a passage I had walked past 10,000 times without ever noticing. Now that I looked for it, I could see the door, could perceive the subtle ways the architecture drew the eye away from it. One of the Custodians turned his head toward me, his movements precise and controlled. "Historitor Valdor Kesh, you will follow. You will not deviate from the path. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will document what you are shown, nothing more. When your work is complete, you will seal your memories under oath binding. Do you understand?" "I understand," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. No, the custodian said softly. You don't, but you will. They led me through the door, and we began to descend. Chapter 2. The Descent into Silence. The passage beyond the hidden door was different from any corridor in the palace I had walked before. The walls were bare stone, not the ornamented surfaces of the upper levels, and they bore no marks of recent maintenance. The air was cold and still, untouched by the circulation systems that kept the rest of the palace habitable. Our footsteps echoed strangely, as if the space around us was larger than it appeared. We descended for what felt like hours. The passage spiraled downward in a gentle curve, lit by ancient glow globes that flickered occasionally, their light spectrum somehow wrong. Too blue, too cold. The custodians moved in perfect silence despite their armor, while every breath I took seemed loud in my own ears. I counted steps to anchor myself. 1,000, 2,000, 5,000. At 10,000 steps, we passed a door marked with symbols in a language I didn't recognize, though I had studied hundreds. The script seemed to shift when I looked directly at it, characters rearranging themselves into different patterns. One of the custodians noticed my gaze. Do not look too closely at the old marks, he said. They predate the Imperium. They predate unified humanity. Some say the Emperor himself carved them during the Age of Strife. Others say he found them already here. What do they say? I couldn't help asking. Warning, ward, welcome. It depends on who reads them and when. The custodian's tone suggested the conversation was over. We continued down. At 15,000 steps, the passage opened into a larger chamber. Here, finally, were signs of the Imperium's presence. Gene-locked doors of adamantium, servo skulls drifting in patrol patterns, weapon turrets that tracked our movement with red targeting beams before recognizing the custodian's signatures and standing down. A massive vault door dominated the far wall, emblazoned with the aquila and sealed with locks that looked like they required biometric data, gene sampling, and probably something more esoteric. A third custodian waited here, somehow more imposing than the two who had escorted me. His armor was different, marked with honors I couldn't name, but which clearly denoted high rank. When he spoke, his voice resonated in a way that suggested vox enhancement, but also something else, a quality of command that made it physically difficult not to listen. Historitor, I am Shield Captain Valdor. He paused, noting my expression. Yes, we share a name. The Captain General himself bestowed it upon you at birth, though you were not told. You are descended from a bloodline that once served the Legio Custodes as scribes and lawkeepers. That blood called you here. Do you understand what that means? I shook my head, overwhelmed. It means you are bound to us by genetics and duty. It means the secrets you are about to learn are secrets your ancestors died keeping. It means that if you speak of what you see here to anyone without authorization, your death will be certain, swift, and absolute. But it also means you are, in a limited sense, one of us. We trust you because we must, because the Emperor himself designed your lineage for this purpose. He let that sink in, watching my face with eyes that seemed to see through flesh to the thoughts beneath. Archive 13 contains records from the final decade of the Unification Wars. You will catalogue them, preserve them, and seal them again. You will work for as long as necessary. When you are finished, you will be brought back to the Hall of Remembrance, and your memories of this place will be ritually bound. You will remember your work, but not the path you took to reach it. Not the faces of those who escorted you, not the precise location. This is for your protection as much as ours. Shield Captain Valdor gestured, and the massive vault door began to open with a pneumatic hiss that spoke of seals being broken after centuries undisturbed. The air that flowed out was stale and dry, preserved by stasis fields, carrying scents of old paper and something else, something organic and long dead. You have 1 week, the Shield Captain said. Food and water will be provided. If you need anything else, call, and a servitor will respond. Do not attempt to leave the archive chamber. Do not attempt to access any vault except those explicitly marked for your attention. And Historitor, if you find anything that disturbs you beyond measure, anything that suggests these records should not be preserved but destroyed, you will tell no one but me, directly. Do you swear this? I swear it, I said, because what else could I say? Then begin. The chamber beyond was vast. Shelves stretched into darkness beyond the range of my glow lamp, filled with data stacks, paper scrolls sealed in protective cases, ancient cogitators whose designs I recognized from technical manuscripts as dating to M29 or even earlier. This was history from before the Imperium, from the desperate centuries when the Emperor had united terror through conquest and cunning. I set up my workspace on a table that looked like it had been waiting for me. Fresh parchment, ink, a portable cogitator for taking notes. Then I began. The first documents were straightforward. Military reports from the conquest of Ursh, the final major kingdom to resist unification. I read accounts of gene warriors fighting proto-Astartes, of atomic weapons deployed against hive cities, of populations reduced to ash because they would not kneel. Grim reading, but nothing I hadn't seen before, in sanitized form. But as I worked deeper into the archive, the documents became stranger. I found references to the Emperor meeting with beings called the Sigilites, plural, though only Malcador was ever publicly known to hold that title. I found accounts of expeditions beneath the Himalaysian plates to recover technology from the Age of Strife, technology that was described with dread and wonder in equal measure. I found records of the Emperor's own words, unfiltered by imperial cult propaganda, speaking of humanity's need to evolve, to transcend the merely human. And I found references, oblique and careful, to something called the wards. The wards were mentioned in multiple documents, always in passing, always assuming the reader knew what they were. They had been established during the Unification Wars. They required constant maintenance. They were guarded by forces that predated the Custodians. And they contained what? The documents never said directly. On the third day, working through a particularly dense stack of technical specifications for early gestation pods used to create the Thunder Warriors, I found a manifest. It was written in the Emperor's own hand. I recognized the script from other documents known to be his, and it listed locations within the palace where critical infrastructure had been installed. Most of the locations were familiar. The throne room, the Sanctum Imperialis, the gene forges that would later create the Space Marines. But at the bottom of the list, marked with that same symbol I had seen on my orders, the spiral within a star within a circle, was a single entry. Sub-level Omega, archive null, ward integrity vessel, permanent seal, no access except by my direct order. Not archive 13 where I now stood. Something deeper, something that required not just secrecy, but active, permanent concealment. I sat back, my hands trembling. I was supposed to catalogue, to document, to preserve. I was not supposed to ask questions, not supposed to investigate. But I was a historitor, and the entire purpose of my existence was to pursue knowledge. I looked at the manifest again, memorizing the symbol. Archive null. The Emperor's direct order. Permanent seal. Archive null. What could be so dangerous that the master of mankind himself had decreed it must never be opened? I spent the rest of my week working mechanically, copying documents and taking notes, but my mind was elsewhere. When Shield Captain Valdor returned to collect me, I had completed my assigned task. The records of Archive 13 were documented, organized, ready to be sealed again. "You have done well," the Shield Captain said, reviewing my work with an expert eye. "Your clearance will be updated. Should similar archives require documentation, you will be called upon again." This was my chance. I took a breath and said, "I found references to Archive Null." The Shield Captain went absolutely still. The two custodians who had escorted me shifted their positions, hands moving fractionally closer to their guardian spears. The air in the chamber seemed to grow colder. "That name," Shield Captain Valdor said softly. is not one you should know. Where did you see it?" I showed him the manifest. He read it, his expression unreadable behind his helm, then carefully set it aside. "You will forget that name. You will forget that symbol. You will never speak of it, never write of it, never think of it if you can avoid doing so. Archive null does not exist. Do you understand?" "Yes," I said, "but I didn't forget. How could I?" The journey back to the Hall of Remembrance was a blur. The oath-binding ceremony followed, conducted by a psyker of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, whose mind felt like ice touching mine. True to the shield captain's word, I remembered my work, but not the path, not the precise location, not the faces of my escort, only their presence, their watchfulness. But I remembered the manifest, and I remembered Archive Null. I should have let it rest. I should have been satisfied with the knowledge I'd gained and returned to my normal duties. But understanding had always been my curse and my calling. Over the following decades, I began to research carefully, obliquely, never asking directly. I looked for patterns in the palace's structure, in old maintenance records, in architectural surveys from before the heresy. I searched for the symbol, the spiral within a star within a circle. And slowly, piece by piece, I began to understand that Archive Null was not just another sealed vault. It was a prison. And what it contained was something the Emperor had forbidden even his Custodes to see. Chapter 3. The pattern emerges. Years passed in the Hall of Remembrance, but my search never truly stopped. It became a background obsession, a puzzle I worked on in the spaces between my official duties. I learned to be patient, to look for connections that others would miss, to read meaning in absences as much as in what was written. The breakthrough came 30 years after my visit to Archive 13, in a place I never expected, the palace's maintenance records. The Imperial Palace requires constant upkeep. Millions of menials, servitors, and tech priests labor endlessly to maintain its systems, atmospheric processors, water recyclers, power conduits, structural supports. The records of this work are vast and tediously detailed, which is precisely why they're ignored by most scholars. Who cares about the repair of a ventilation shaft in sub-level 40 when there are battles and crusades to document? But I had learned that the most important secrets are often hidden in the mundane. I spent months reviewing maintenance logs, looking for patterns. Specifically, I was looking for areas of the palace where no work was ever recorded, not because they didn't need maintenance, but because they were maintained by someone else, by forces that didn't file standard work orders with the administratum. I found 17 such zones scattered throughout the palace's deep levels. They appeared as gaps in the records, spaces where the usual schedules simply stopped. Most were small, just a chamber or two. But one zone was vast, encompassing what the architectural surveys suggested was thousands of cubic meters of space across multiple sub-levels. It was centered directly beneath the throne room. I cross-referenced this discovery with power consumption records. The throne itself required obscene amounts of energy, fed by the sacrifice of 10,000 psykers daily. But there were power draws beneath the throne that couldn't be accounted for by its known systems. Massive amounts of energy flowing into areas that officially didn't exist, used for purposes no record explained. The pieces were coming together. Archive Null was not just a sealed vault. It was an entire complex hidden in the deepest reaches of the palace, consuming enough power to run a hive city maintained by forces that answered to no one but the Emperor himself or the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes. I found more clues in unexpected places. A technical manual for early void shield generators, dating to M29, contained a note about special configurations for containment rather than deflection. A fragment of a letter from Malcador the Sigilite to an unknown recipient mentioned the ward's holding, though the burden grows heavier with each passing year. A Medici record from the Unification Wars described injuries sustained by an unnamed custodian who had been exposed to the deep radiations despite full armor. Deep radiations. The term appeared in multiple places, always in reference to the palace's lowest levels. but it wasn't radioactive contamination in the conventional sense. The medical terminology suggested something that affected the mind and soul as much as the body, something warp-related perhaps, but not exactly. I began to have dreams, not the nightmares of warp corruption that everyone in the Imperium was taught to recognize and report, but strange crystalline visions of vast spaces beneath the palace of machinery that predated the Imperium by millennia, of something that watched and waited and had been watching and waiting since before humanity left Terra the first time in the dark age of technology. I told no one. But I think Hester knew. She'd grown even older, her rejuvenate treatments failing at last, and she watched me with an expression that mixed pity and understanding. "You're looking for something," she said to me one day, speaking softly in the empty hours of a night shift. "Something you saw in Archive 13. I know because I did the same thing, once. I found enough to understand that some questions don't have answers that help us sleep." "What did you find?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not what I found, what found me. There are forces in the palace that notice when someone digs too deep. The Custodians, obviously, but also others. The Sisters of Silence sometimes walk the deep archives. They don't speak, of course, but their presence is a message. They watch those who watch too closely." As if summoned by her words, I felt a presence. Not heard, not seen, but felt. The peculiar absence that marked one of the silent sisterhood. I turned and saw her standing in the shadows between shelves, her armor black as void, her face hidden behind a skull helm. She had been there for some time, I realized, watching me. She did not move or make any gesture, but the message was clear. I was noticed. I was being evaluated. And if I crossed a line I couldn't yet see, she would act. Hester had been right. I should have stopped. But I couldn't. The next discovery came from an unlikely source, a half-mad scribe in the Astronomicon chamber. I encountered him during a routine transfer of documents, a withered man whose mind had been partially burned out by proximity to the psychic beacon, but who retained strange fragmentary knowledge. "You're looking for the old thing," he said when I passed him in the corridor, his words slurring, but his eyes suddenly sharp. "Down in the deep down, where the Emperor put what he couldn't kill. You think he's all-powerful. He's not. He's strong, yes, strong enough to conquer a world, a system, a galaxy. But there are older things than him, things that were here before, and some of them can't be killed, only contained." I tried to question him further, but his lucidity had passed. He wandered off muttering about the light, the terrible light that burns souls to fuel the beacon, but his words stayed with me. What he couldn't kill, only contained. I returned to the maintenance records with new perspective. If Archive Null wasn't just a vault but a containment facility, what would that require? Isolation, certainly. Psychic shielding. Physical barriers that could withstand forces beyond conventional understanding. And most importantly, guards. I found them in the personnel records, though their existence was carefully obscured. Every decade, a handful of Custodians would be recorded as transferred to Special Assignment Sub-Level Omega. They never appeared in any other records afterward. They were gone, removed from the normal rotation, dedicated to a duty that consumed their entire existence. How many Custodians had been lost to this eternal vigil over 10,000 years? Hundreds. Thousands. The thought was staggering. The Adeptus Custodes numbered only 10,000, each one irreplaceable. To dedicate even a fraction of their strength to permanent guard duty suggested the threat must be extraordinary. I made my most dangerous discovery in a place I should never have been able to access: the personal records of Rogal Dorn. The Primarch of the Imperial Fists had been the Emperor's Praetorian, the one charged with fortifying Terra during the heresy. His architectural genius had redesigned much of the palace's defenses, and in his personal notes, encrypted but not destroyed when he departed for his last mission, I found references to reinforcing the deep containment and additional layers to ensure the breach cannot propagate upward. The breach, capital B, a proper name for something specific, something terrible. Dorn's notes also contained diagrams. I spent weeks decrypting them, using techniques I had learned across centuries of archival work. When I finally succeeded, I wished I hadn't. The diagrams showed the area beneath the throne room in cutaway view, multiple levels descending like an inverted tower, each one wrapped in layers of shielding, both technological and mystical. At the bottom, rendered in precise detail, was a chamber. And in that chamber, something was drawn that my mind refused to properly process. My eyes could see the lines, the symbols, the technical annotations, but my brain couldn't assemble them into coherent meaning. It was as if some protective mechanism in my psyche was preventing me from understanding what Rogal Dorn had so carefully documented. But one thing was clear: whatever was in that deepest chamber was alive. The diagrams showed containment systems designed to suppress, not preserve. Force fields meant to push inward, psychic dampeners focused on a single point, and most tellingly, a notation in Dorn's handwriting. Subject displays awareness of observation. Recommend limiting visual inspection to necessary maintenance only. Personnel report persistent nightmares following exposure. I sat in my quarters that night, the encrypted data slate hidden beneath my bed, and tried to understand what I had learned. The Emperor, during the Unification Wars, had found something beneath terror. Something old, something powerful, something that couldn't be destroyed. He had built a prison for it, had dedicated some of his mightiest warriors to eternal guard duty, had hidden its existence from all but the most trusted. Even his Custodes, who knew all his other secrets, were kept away from this one final truth. Why? What could be so dangerous that the master of mankind couldn't afford to let anyone know it existed? I made my decision then. I would find Archive Null. I would see what the Emperor had hidden, not because I was brave or foolish, but because I was a historitor, and the entire point of my existence was to uncover and preserve truth. The fact that this particular truth might destroy me, or worse, was simply the price of my calling. It took me another decade to prepare. I studied the patrol patterns of the Custodians, noting when shifts changed and where gaps in coverage might exist, however briefly. I requisitioned access to maintenance tunnels under the pretext of cataloguing structural history. I learned to move through the palace's deep levels without attracting attention, to become another anonymous robed figure among thousands. I cultivated relationships with tech priests who maintained the deep systems, carefully steering conversations toward the lowest levels without asking directly about them. I learned which areas were patrolled by servitors programmed to report unusual activity and which were considered too secure to require such basic monitoring. And I waited for my opportunity. It came during the festival of the Emperor's Ascension, when much of the palace's attention was focused on ceremonies and crowds above. The deep archives would be minimally staffed, the Custodians' attention directed toward protecting the public spaces where billions of pilgrims gathered. I made my final preparations. I wrote letters to be delivered if I didn't return, not explaining where I had gone, but ensuring my archives would be preserved and my few personal effects distributed to the other historitors. I performed the prayers and rituals expected of any loyal servant of the Imperium, though I was painfully aware that what I was about to do would be considered heresy of the highest order. Then, on the first day of the festival, while hymns echoed through the palace, its upper reaches, and the Astronomicon burned bright with the faith of quintillions, I descended into the deep places of the world. The path I took was one I had mapped over years of careful study, through maintenance tunnels that hadn't been inspected in centuries, past servitor stations I knew would be unmanned during the festival, down passages whose existence was recorded only in the oldest architectural surveys. I carried nothing but a glow lamp, a data slate for recording what I found, and the symbol I had memorized from the Emperor's manifest, the spiral within a star within a circle. At sublevel 50, deeper than I had ever been, I found a door that matched the symbol. It was small, unremarkable, the kind of access hatch that could lead to a maintenance junction or storage chamber. But carved into its frame, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for, was the mark. I pressed my hand against it, and the door opened. The passage beyond descended at a steep angle, carved directly into bedrock. There were no lights here. My glow lamp pushed back the darkness only a few meters ahead, revealing walls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The air was cold and still, and had a quality that made each breath feel heavy in my lungs. I descended for what felt like hours, though time became strange in that darkness. My chrono said only 30 minutes had passed, but my body insisted it had been longer. The passage spiraled down and down, following some path that predated Imperial architecture, following something older than the palace, older than the Emperor's reign. And then I reached the bottom and found myself standing before the true entrance to Archive Null. 2 custodians stood guard, their armor gleaming even in the minimal light. They should have stopped me, should have killed me for being where no one unauthorized was meant to be, but they didn't move. They stood frozen, utterly still, their poses suggesting they had been there for a very long time. I approached cautiously and realized with horror that they weren't standing guard. They had been standing guard once, but now they were statues, their armor fused to the stone floor, their faces behind their helms long since dead. How long had they been here? Centuries? Millennia? The door beyond them was massive, 20 meters tall, and covered in wards that made my eyes water to look at directly. Psych-reactive symbols that writhed and shifted. Mechanical locks of a design I'd never seen. And at the center, large enough to be clearly visible even from a distance, the spiral within a star within a circle. I had found it. Archive Null. The place the Emperor forbade even his Custodes to see. And the door was opening. Chapter 4. What Dwells. Below the door wasn't opening for me. I realized that immediately. It was opening on its own, had been opening for some time perhaps, slowly grinding outward with the sound of mechanisms that hadn't moved in millennia. Ice cracked and fell from the seal in sheets. The psychic wards flickered and died, their power sources finally exhausted after 10,000 years of continuous operation. This was wrong. This was catastrophically wrong. Whatever containment the Emperor had established, it was failing. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to flee back up the passage, to alert the Custodians, to sound whatever alarm would bring the full might of the Imperial Palace's defenders down to this place. But I was frozen, caught between terror and overwhelming curiosity. The door opened wide enough for a person to slip through, and from the darkness beyond came a sound. Not loud, but pervasive. A low thrumming that I felt in my bones before I heard it with my ears. It was rhythmic, almost like breathing, but too slow, each cycle taking 30 seconds or more. Light spilled out next, but not any light I had ever seen. It was the color of deep water, blue-green and somehow thick, casting shadows that fell in wrong directions. The light moved like liquid, flowing out through the door and pooling on the floor, lapping against the base of the dead Custodian's armored boots. I took a step back, my hand instinctively reaching for a weapon I didn't carry. The light noticed the movement. It shifted, oriented on me, and I felt something vast and ancient turn its attention in my direction. "Finally," a voice said, speaking in perfect high Gothic, but with an accent that suggested the words were being formed by something that didn't naturally have a mouth. "Finally, someone sees. Someone knows. Someone can bear witness to what he did, what he buried, what he hoped would stay buried forever." The light coalesced, formed into something almost humanoid, but wrong in every proportion. Too tall, too thin, with too many joints in its limbs, and a face that seemed to have features but changed every time I tried to focus on them. It stepped through the doorway, and where its feet touched the stone, ice formed, spreading out in fractal patterns that looked almost like words in languages that predated speech. "Don't be afraid," the thing said, its voice almost kind. "Or rather, be afraid, because you should be, but know that your fear is meaningless. I won't hurt you. I can't hurt you. Not here, not while the last of his wards hold. And they're failing, yes, but slowly. I have time. I have always had time." I found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. What are you? The thing laughed, a sound like crystal breaking. What am I? I am old. I am from before your kind looked up at the stars and wondered. I am from when terror was young and humanity was barely more than clever animals huddling in caves. I am the reason the Emperor hid this place, why he told no one, why he ordered even his Custodes to stay away. It moved closer, and I could see now that its form was not solid, but somehow composed of that strange light. Billions of motes held together in a shape that approximated humanity without truly achieving it. I am Caordain, it said. In your tongue, it would mean something like memory of mountains, or that which remains when all else erodes. I am the last of my kind, the final survivor of a race that ruled terror when your species was still learning to make fire. And your emperor, your oh-so-mighty emperor, found me deep beneath the earth during his conquest of terror, and he couldn't kill me, so he locked me away and prayed I would never wake again. My mind raced, trying to understand, to contextualize what I was hearing within everything I knew about Imperial history. The Emperor had unified terror through conquest, yes, but the official histories spoke of fighting human techno-barbarians, gene cults, and the remnants of Dark Age civilization. Nothing about ancient Xenos, nothing about non-human intelligence that predated humanity. You're lying, I said, though I didn't believe it even as I spoke. The Emperor would have destroyed you. He would never leave a Xenos alive, especially not on Terra itself. Caordain tilted its head, and I saw something like pity in its expression, if expression was even the right word for what happened to its ever-shifting face. Oh, child, I'm not Xenos. I'm not alien to this world. You are. My kind were here first. We watched your ancestors crawl out of the oceans. We saw you discover tools, fire, agriculture, civilization. We were old when your kind was young, and we made a terrible mistake. We tried to guide you, to help you, to accelerate your evolution, because we were lonely and wanted companions who could understand even a fraction of what we knew. The thing's form rippled, and suddenly I saw images in the light, visions of a terror that never appeared in any history, towering structures of crystal and force, cities that floated on waves of controlled gravity, beings of pure energy walking among early humans who looked at them with wonder rather than fear. We gave you gifts, Caordain continued. Knowledge, technology. We showed you the secrets of the atom, the genome, the warp. We thought we were being kind. We thought we were uplifting you to stand beside us. The visions darkened. I saw the crystal cities burning, the energy beings torn apart by weapons that turned their own power against them. I saw early humans, no longer primitive, wielding technology they barely understood to commit genocide against their former benefactors. But you didn't want companions. You wanted to be alone at the top, so you killed us, systematically, efficiently, with a thoroughness that would have impressed us if we hadn't been the victims. You hunted us to extinction, and you did it so completely that within a few generations, no one even remembered we had existed. We became myths, then legends, then less than legends. Just strange dreams that some people had, easily dismissed. Caordain's form solidified slightly, becoming more defined, more real in a way that made my skin crawl. But I survived. I hid myself away in the deepest places of the earth, in a fold of space-time that wasn't quite real, and I slept. I slept through the rise and fall of your civilizations, through the age of technology, through the age of strife. I slept until he came. The thing's voice became softer, tinged with something like respect. The Emperor, the anathema, the man who made himself more than human. He found me during his conquest of the Himalaysian plates, deep in a bunker from the Dark Age that had been built on top of even older ruins. I woke when his presence touched my prison, and I saw him clearly for what he was. A human who had transcended humanity, who had become something new, something perhaps worthy of the gifts we had tried to give. I spoke with him. For days, perhaps weeks. Time was strange in that place. I told him what I've told you, that my kind came before, that we tried to help, that we were destroyed for our kindness. I offered him knowledge, showed him secrets that even the Dark Age hadn't uncovered. I offered to teach him everything I knew, to make him truly immortal, truly godlike. Caordain's laugh was bitter. He refused. Not because he didn't want the knowledge, oh, he wanted it desperately, but because he understood something I hadn't, that I was still angry, that 10,000 years of sleep hadn't healed the wound of my species' extinction, that if I were free, if I had even a fraction of my old power back, I would seek revenge against the humans who killed my people. Even though those specific humans had been dead for millennia, the thing moved closer still until it was almost within reach. So he built this prison, this perfect, terrible prison, deep beneath what would become his throne room. He designed it to last forever, to hold me in a state between sleeping and waking, aware enough to suffer, but constrained enough never to act. He set guards, his custodes, those golden angels, but he told them never to look inside, never to know what they guarded. Because if they knew, if anyone knew, they might make the choice he refused to make, to learn from me, to take the knowledge I offered. And he understood that knowledge of a certain kind is itself a poison. I was beginning to understand the magnitude of what I was witnessing. The Emperor hadn't just hidden a dangerous Xenos. He had hidden proof that humanity wasn't the first, wasn't special, wasn't destined to rule simply by right of existence. He had hidden evidence that humanity had committed genocide against a more advanced species and then forgotten about it completely. If this knowledge became public, if the Imperium learned that humanity's reign was built on the extinction of a species that had tried to help us, what would that do to the Imperial cult? To the belief that humanity was rightfully supreme? To the entire ideological foundation of the Imperium? You understand now, Caordain said, reading my expression. You see why he hid me, why he could never let anyone know. It wasn't fear of my power. By the time he found me, I had almost none left. It was fear of what I represented, the lie at the heart of humanity's self-image. The uncomfortable truth that you are not the innocent victims of Xenos aggression. Not always, not originally. Sometimes you were the monsters. But why are you telling me this? I asked. Why reveal yourself now? The thing's form flickered, and I saw for the first time that it was not entirely solid, not entirely present. It was fading, becoming translucent. Because I'm dying. Finally. Truly dying. The Emperor's prison has held me for 10,000 years, but it's been killing me slowly, grinding me down to nothing. The wards are failing not because I'm escaping, but because there's soon nothing left to contain. In a century, maybe two, I'll be gone completely. But before I fade, before I join the rest of my kind in absolute extinction, I wanted one person to know, one human to understand what was lost, what your species destroyed, what the Emperor buried. Caordain reached out with a hand made of light, stopping just short of touching me. You're a historian, a keeper of truths, so keep this truth, even if you can never speak it. Know that your Emperor, your God on Earth, isn't the hero you think he is. He's pragmatic, yes, powerful, absolutely, but also afraid. Afraid of truths that might unravel his carefully constructed Imperium. He chose to let the lie stand, to let humanity believe in its own innate superiority, rather than face the complicated reality of our history. The thing began to withdraw back toward the door, its form becoming less distinct with each step. You'll have choices to make now, historian. You can report what you've seen, try to expose this secret, and watch as you're declared a heretic and executed, if you're lucky. More likely, you'll simply disappear, another loose thread tidied away. Or you can keep silent, let me fade into final death, let the secret die with me. Either way, you'll carry the weight of this knowledge for whatever remains of your life. But know this, I don't hate you. I don't hate humanity, not anymore. I'm too tired for hate, too close to the end. I just wanted someone to know. Someone to remember that we existed, that we tried to help, and that we were destroyed for it. Is that so much to ask? I couldn't speak. The weight of what I had learned pressed down on me like physical force. Everything I had believed about humanity's place in the galaxy, everything the Imperium taught, everything the Emperor's vision was built upon, all of it was complicated by this single truth. Go, Custodians said softly. Return to your archives. Live your life. Die peacefully in your bed if you're lucky. Just remember, in the depths of night when you can't sleep, that we existed. That's all I ask. Just remember us. The thing faded back through the door, and the strange light went with it, leaving me in near darkness with only my glow lamp to push back the shadows. The massive door began to close again, grinding shut with the sound of metal on stone. I stood there for a long moment, trying to process what had happened, trying to understand what I should do. Should I report this? Should I try to find Shield Captain Valdor, tell him the containment was failing? Should I speak with the Captain General himself? Or should I do what Custodians suggested? Keep silent. Let the secret die. Preserve the lie that had held the Imperium together for 10,000 years. I didn't know. I still don't know. What I do know is that I turned and walked back up the passage, past the dead Custodians, who would stand eternal guard over a prisoner that was already almost gone. I returned to the maintenance tunnels, to the archives, to my normal life. I wrote my reports and catalogued my documents and pretended that nothing had changed. But everything had changed. And now I'm telling you, whoever finds this account, because I'm old and dying and like Custodians, I want someone to know, someone to remember. The Emperor forbade his Custodes to see what lay in Archive Null, not because it was dangerous to look upon, but because it was dangerous to know. Because some truths are more destructive than any weapon. And now you know it too. Chapter 5. The Price of Knowledge. I didn't go mad immediately. That's what people expect, isn't it? That forbidden knowledge drives you instantly insane, that you scream and tear your hair and need to be restrained. The truth is more insidious. The truth is that you continue, day after day, carrying the weight of what you know and pretending everything is normal. I returned to my duties in the Hall of Remembrance. I catalogued documents and trained younger historitors and attended the endless meetings that made up the bureaucracy of knowledge-keeping. I smiled when expected, frowned when appropriate, participated in the rituals and routines that gave structure to life in the Imperial Palace. But at night, I dreamed of crystal cities burning and beings of light being torn apart by human hands. I dreamed of Custodians' fading form and the question implicit in its final words. What do you do with truth that serves no purpose except to hurt? Hestor was the first to notice something was wrong. She cornered me in the archives 3 months after my journey to Archive Null, her ancient eyes seeing through my carefully maintained facade. "You found it," she said without preamble. "Whatever you were looking for, you found it. And now you wish you hadn't." I wanted to deny it, but I was tired of lying. "Yes. And you can't speak of it, can you? Not because you've been oath-bound, though I suspect that would happen if you tried, but because you understand that some things are better left buried." "Yes." Hester nodded slowly. "I told you I made the same search once. I didn't get as far as you did. I was stopped by the Custodians before I could reach the deep places. But I saw enough to understand that there are secrets in this palace that exist for good reason. The Emperor didn't hide them because he was ashamed or afraid. He hid them because he loved humanity enough to let us believe comfortable lies." She put a withered hand on my shoulder, the gesture surprisingly gentle. "You'll have to decide what kind of historian you are, Valdor. Are you the kind who serves truth above all, even when truth is destructive? Or are you the kind who understands that knowledge has purpose, that sometimes the greatest wisdom is knowing what not to reveal? Both choices have honor. Both choices have consequences." I had no answer for her then. I'm not sure I have one now. Life continued. Years became decades. I was promoted to senior historitor, granted access to even deeper archives, though none as deep as Archive Null. I trained others, passed on my knowledge, taught them to see patterns in history, and to understand that what we preserved was as important as what we were taught. But I was careful. So careful. I never mentioned Custodians, never spoke of the Crystal Cities or the revelation that humanity's supremacy was built on genocide. When training new historitors, I emphasized the importance of considering multiple perspectives, of understanding that history is written by victors, but I never explained why I stressed these lessons so heavily. The dreams never stopped. Some nights, I saw Custodians' death, not as it was happening, but as it would eventually happen, the last of that ancient light finally guttering out in the darkness beneath the throne. Other nights, I saw the Emperor during the Unification Wars, finding that prison in the depths of the Himalayan plates, making the choice to hide rather than destroy, to contain rather than reveal. I began to understand that choice better as I aged. The Emperor had built an Imperium on certain assumptions, that humanity was special, that we had been victimized by Xenos and the Warp, that our suffering justified our conquest and our cruelty. If he had revealed the truth about Custodians' people, if he had admitted that humanity had once been the aggressors, that we had committed genocide against a species that tried to help us, what would that have done to his vision? Would humanity have accepted it? Would the newly unified terror have fractured again over the philosophical implications? He had made a calculated decision, preserved the lie because the lie served humanity better than the truth. And having made that decision, he had to ensure no one could ever reveal it, even his custodes, even his most loyal servants. Because if they knew, they might make different choices. They might decide the truth mattered more than unity. 5 decades after my journey to Archive Null, I was summoned by Shield Captain Valdor, the same custodian who had first escorted me to Archive 13, though I couldn't know if it was truly the same individual. Their armor obscured their faces, their lifespans exceeded normal humans by orders of magnitude, and they changed so little over time that centuries might pass without visible aging. He received me in a chamber I had never been to before, small and private by the standards of the Imperial Palace, with walls bare of decoration and a single chair that he did not invite me to use. "Historitor Kesh," he said, his voice carrying that quality of command that made it difficult not to stand straighter. "You accessed Archive 13 73 years ago. You performed your duties admirably. Your work was exemplary." I waited, knowing there was more. "In the years since, you have been observed. Your movements through the palace, your research, your interests, all have been noted. You have been careful not to ask direct questions, not to make obvious searches. But patterns emerge over time, and we are very good at recognizing patterns." My blood went cold. This was it then. They knew I had found Archive Null. They knew I had seen Custodians, and now I would be quietly disappeared, another secret tidied away. But Shield Captain Valdor surprised me. "You went down to the deep places," he said. "You found what the Emperor sealed. You spoke with it, and then you returned and said nothing. That is unusual. Most who make it that far try to expose what they've learned, or they go mad with the weight of it. But you did neither. You simply carried on with your duties. Why? I considered lying, but what would be the point? Because I understood why it was hidden. Because I realized that some truths serve no one." The Shield Captain was silent for a long moment, his helm betraying no expression. "The prisoner below is dying," he finally said. "We've known for centuries that the containment isn't perfect, that entropy is taking its toll. In another century or two, there will be nothing left to contain." The Emperor understood this when he built the prison. It was never meant to be permanent, just long enough for the creature to fade away naturally, taking its secrets with it. He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming in the small space. "You are one of 3 living humans who know what lies in Archive Null. One is the Captain General himself. Another is a Sister of Silence who has guarded the approaches for 400 years. And now you. When the prisoner finally dies, when the containment can be safely dismantled, we will need someone to document what was there, to create a final record, encrypted and sealed, so that if similar situations arise in the future, the Imperium will have precedent for how to handle them. You want me to write its obituary, I said, understanding. We want you to ensure that its existence is not forgotten entirely, but that the knowledge is contained, controlled, released only if absolutely necessary. You've proven you can carry such knowledge without being destroyed by it or compelled to reveal it. That makes you invaluable. Shield Captain Valdor moved to the door, then paused. The Emperor made hard choices during the Unification Wars. He did what was necessary to ensure humanity's survival, even when necessity required him to hide uncomfortable truths. He built the Imperium on a foundation of carefully curated myths because pure truth would have torn us apart. Do you condemn him for that? I thought about it carefully before answering. I don't know. I understand why he did it. I might have made the same choice in his position, but understanding and approval aren't the same thing. No, the Shield Captain agreed. They are not, but understanding is enough. Return to your duties, Historitor. You will be contacted when the time comes. Until then, carry your knowledge as you have been doing, silently, carefully, and know that you are not alone in bearing this weight. He left, and I stood in the empty chamber for a long time, trying to process what had happened. They had known. They had always known. And rather than killing me, or mind-wiping me, or any of the other solutions they could have employed, they had decided I was useful, that my ability to carry secrets made me valuable. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt trapped. I had become part of the conspiracy of silence, complicit in the very thing I had once sought to expose. But wasn't that always how it happened? You started by seeking truth, and you ended by helping to bury it, because you came to understand that truth was more complicated than you thought. That the simple stories people needed to function were sometimes more important than accuracy. I returned to my work, but I was changed. I began to see the architecture of lies that held the Imperium together. Not just the secret of Custodians, but thousands of other suppressions and adjustments and careful omissions. The real history of the Space Marine legions before the heresy. The true cost of the Emperor's psychic powers. The deals made with forces that the Imperium officially denied existed. The compromises. The moral grey zones. The times when humanity had to become monstrous to survive. And I understood that this was my role now. To know the truth, but preserve the lie. To document reality, but ensure it stayed hidden. To serve history by making sure history never emerged into the light. The younger historitors I trained didn't know why I taught them the way I did. They didn't understand why I emphasized the importance of understanding context, of recognizing when truth needed to be suppressed for the greater good. They thought I was just old and cautious, worn down by centuries of bureaucratic service. They were right, in a way. I was worn down. The weight of knowledge was eroding me, just as surely as the Emperor's prison had eroded Custodians. Every day I carried the secret was another day I felt it eating at me, asking questions I couldn't answer. Was I doing the right thing? Was silence complicity? Was I a guardian of necessary secrets, or just a coward, afraid to let truth destroy the world I knew? Hester died in my 250th year of service. Her rejuvenate had finally failed completely, and her body simply gave out during a routine shift in the archives. She died surrounded by the knowledge she had spent 7 centuries preserving and occasionally suppressing. At her memorial service, held in a small chapel in the palace's middle reaches, I spoke about her dedication to truth and her wisdom in understanding that truth had many forms. I didn't mention that she had known I was searching for Archive Null, that she had tried to warn me, that she had carried her own secrets to the grave. But I thought about it. I thought about how many other historitors over the millennia had found pieces of the truth and chosen to remain silent. How many had made the same calculation I had made, that preserving the Imperium was more important than exposing its foundations as flawed. We were a priesthood of lies, I realized. Keepers of faith in a different sense than the ecclesiarchy. Not faith in the Emperor's divinity, but faith that the lies holding humanity together were better than the truths that would tear it apart. And maybe that was necessary. Maybe that was even right. But it didn't make it easier to sleep at night. The dreams continued, evolving over time. Now I didn't just see Custodians and its dying species. I saw the Emperor making his choice. I saw the Custodians standing guard over a secret they didn't understand. I saw the countless humans across the galaxy who believed in humanity's inherent righteousness because people like me kept certain truths hidden. I saw, in other words, the machinery of necessary evil that kept the Imperium functioning. And I understood that I had become a part of that machinery, another cog in the vast engine of suppression and control. Not because I was evil, but because someone had to do it. Someone had to bear the weight of knowing so that billions could live in blissful ignorance. Was that nobility or cowardice? Service or sin? I still don't know. What I do know is that when my time comes, when I finally complete my term of service, and either die or retire to some quiet corner of the Imperium, I will pass this burden to another. The knowledge will continue, carefully preserved and carefully hidden, waiting for the day when it might be needed, or waiting for the day when Archive Null can finally be opened safely, when Custodians has faded to nothing, when the last evidence of humanity's original sin has been erased by time itself. Until then, we wait, we watch, we keep the secrets that must be kept, even from the Emperor's Custodes, especially from them. Chapter 6. The Long Silence. Time in the Hall of Remembrance moved differently than in the rest of the Imperium. While outside our walls, crusades were launched and worlds burned and heroes rose and fell, we moved at the pace of preservation. Careful, methodical, eternal. A decade was barely enough time to properly process a single campaign's worth of documentation. A century was a reasonable time frame for researching a particular historical question. I had been a historitor for 3 centuries now, and by the standards of the palace, I was still relatively young. My body, maintained by regular rejuvenate treatments and the careful attention of the palace medicae, could theoretically last another 400 or 500 years. My mind was sharp, my memories intact, my capabilities undiminished. But the weight of the secret I carried had changed something fundamental in me. I moved through my duties like a man underwater, performing each task with precision, but feeling somehow distant from the world around me. The other historitors noticed, though they couldn't articulate what had changed. I was more reserved in conversation, less likely to engage in the theoretical debates about historical interpretation that had once animated our late-shift discussions. I still taught, still mentored, still performed my duties flawlessly, but the passion had been replaced by something else, not quite resignation, but a kind of grim acceptance that this was my role, and I would fulfill it regardless of how I felt about it. Shield Captain Valdor visited me twice more over the following century. The first time was to inform me that Custodians had stopped communicating entirely. The ward keepers, those custodians who maintained the prison without ever seeing what lay inside, reported that the subtle psychic emanations from Archive Null had ceased. The creature was entering its final phase of death, withdrawing into itself as the last of its energy faded. "It will be soon," the Shield Captain told me. "Perhaps 50 years, perhaps 100. You should begin preparing the final documentation. Research what you need to know about the species, about the technology of containment, about the Emperor's methods. When the time comes, you must work quickly. Once it dies, once we can confirm the threat is ended, we will need to seal the archive permanently. You will have perhaps a week to complete your work." The second visit came 30 years later. This time, Shield Captain Valdor brought someone with him, the Sister of Silence he had mentioned, the other living human who knew what lay in Archive Null. She was ancient, her face beneath the skull helm carved with centuries of service. Her armor was marked with honors I couldn't identify, battles and victories that had never been publicly recorded. She stood like a void in the room, her null field damping the ambient psychic energy that existed in all spaces of the Imperial Palace. Shield Captain Valdor spoke for both of them. Sister Severine has maintained the outer watch on Archive Null for 417 years. She has never entered, never seen the prisoner, but she has felt its presence through the walls. She reports that the presence has diminished to almost nothing. The end is approaching. Sister Severine looked at me with eyes that held no judgment, only a kind of profound weariness. She made a sign in battle cant, and Shield Captain Valdor translated. She asks if you are ready, if you have made peace with the role you must play. I thought about the question carefully. I don't know if peace is possible, but I'm prepared to do what's necessary. Sister Severine nodded, made another sign, and Shield Captain Valdor's tone shifted slightly, becoming almost gentle. She says that all who guard dangerous truths eventually feel what you're feeling. The isolation, the weight, the sense that you're being slowly poisoned by knowledge that can never be shared. She says it's the price we pay for protecting humanity from itself. And she says, he paused, as if unsure whether to translate the next part, that the price is worth it, even when it doesn't feel like it. They left me then, and I returned to my preparations. I began compiling what would become the definitive account of Custodians species, drawing from fragments scattered across the archives, archaeological reports that mentioned artifacts from before human civilization, xenological studies of technology that predated the Dark Age, theoretical papers about non-human intelligence on Terra that had been classified and suppressed. I had to be careful. If I made my research too obvious, too focused, someone might notice and ask questions. So I buried it among other projects, made it look like a broader study of pre-unification Terra, disguised my true purpose behind layers of academic inquiry. I found more than I expected. References to the first ones in documents from Old Night, mentions of crystal builders in archaeological surveys from the Unification Wars, even a few fragments of what might have been Custodians' language, mathematical concepts that didn't quite fit human notation, symbols that seemed to describe spatial relationships in ways that suggested a different perceptual framework. Assembling it all was like reconstructing a shattered mirror. I could see pieces of what Custodians species had been, their technology, their civilization, their attempted partnership with early humanity, but the full picture remained fragmented, incomplete. Too much had been lost, deliberately destroyed by humans who wanted no reminder of what they'd done. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was documenting a genocide while being complicit in ensuring that documentation would never see light. I was preserving a history for the specific purpose of keeping it hidden. The contradictions should have torn me apart, but by now I had learned to live with contradiction. It was the only way to survive in my position. During this period, I began to have a new recurring dream. In it, I stood in the Hall of Remembrance, surrounded by the archives of 10,000 years of Imperial history. But as I watched, the shelves began to burn. Not with normal fire, but with that same blue-green light I had seen in Archive Null. The flames didn't destroy the documents. Instead, they made them transparent, revealing the truth beneath the officially recorded history. I saw the real cost of compliance campaigns, the worlds that had been virus-bombed, not for resisting, but for knowing too much. I saw the Space Marine legions before the heresy, already showing the flaws that would lead to their fall. I saw the Emperor himself, making deals with powers that would later be declared anathema, compromising and calculating, and doing whatever was necessary to advance his vision for humanity. And I saw myself, standing in the center of it all, carefully annotating these truths while ensuring they would never be known. I always woke from this dream with a sense of profound sadness, though I couldn't have said exactly what I was mourning. The loss of innocence, perhaps. The death of the belief that truth and righteousness naturally aligned. My relationships with the other Historitors became increasingly strained. They could sense something was wrong, but couldn't identify what. Some thought I'd become bitter with age, disappointed that my centuries of service hadn't earned me higher rank or greater recognition. Others believed I was simply burning out, reaching the limits of how long a human mind could engage in the same work without breaking. Both theories had elements of truth, but neither captured the real issue. I had learned that the institution I served, which I had believed existed to preserve truth, actually existed to curate it, to decide which truths served the Imperium and which threatened it, to maintain the necessary fictions that allowed 10,000 years of brutal empire to be justified as righteous crusade. I wasn't angry about this. Anger would have implied I thought there was an alternative, that humanity could function without such fictions. I had lived long enough and read enough history to know that every civilization told itself stories to justify its existence, to explain why its violence was necessary and righteous. The Imperium was simply more honest about it, at least internally, among those of us who were allowed to see behind the curtain. But understanding the necessity didn't make it easier to accept. And living with that contradiction was slowly grinding me down. I threw myself into my work with renewed intensity, perhaps hoping that immersion in the minutiae of historical documentation would distract me from larger questions. I trained a new generation of historitors with meticulous care, passing on not just techniques, but wisdom about the nature of knowledge itself. History, I told them, is not just facts, it's narrative. And narrative requires selection, what to include, what to exclude, what to emphasize. Every choice you make as a historian shapes how future generations understand the past. That's not corruption. That's the nature of the work. But you must be conscious of those choices. You must understand that you are not just recording history, you are constructing it. Some of them grasped what I was really saying, that we were not passive observers, but active participants in shaping what humanity believed about itself, that this was both great responsibility and terrible burden. Others heard only the surface meaning and nodded and went about their work believing that objective history was possible if only one was careful enough. I envied them their innocence. The years continued to pass. The Imperium ground on, suffering and surviving, losing worlds and reclaiming them, fighting endless wars against chaos and Xenos and its own internal corruption. The Hall of Remembrance documented it all, preserving the official narrative while quietly maintaining shadow archives that told more complicated truths. And beneath it all, in Archive Null, Custodians was dying. Slowly, incrementally, fading like a star going cold. The wardkeepers reported that the containment cells now registered only the faintest traces of the energy that had once filled them. The creature was barely there anymore, more absence than presence. I should have felt relief. The threat would soon be ended. The secret would die with its subject. I could complete my final documentation and then perhaps find some measure of peace, knowing that the burden would be lifted. But instead, I felt grief. Not for Custodians specifically. I had met it only once, briefly, and it had been more concept than being even then. But for what it represented, the last evidence of humanity's complicated history, proof that we were not the innocent victims we pretended to be. When it finally died, when the last spark of its existence guttered out, humanity would be able to believe fully in its own mythology. The lie would become complete, total, unquestionable. There would be no living reminder that things had been different, that we had made choices that led us to this point, that our supremacy was built on older foundations than we admitted. Perhaps that was good. Perhaps complete belief in the lie would give humanity the unity and purpose it needed to survive in a hostile galaxy. The Emperor had thought so when he built Archive Null. Who was I to question his wisdom? But still, I grieved. For the truth that would die, for the complexity that would be lost, for the uncomfortable knowledge that would be buried forever beneath layers of necessary fiction. The dreams continued. The weight of knowledge continued to press down on me, and I continued to work, preparing for the day when I would be called upon to document the end of humanity's last direct connection to its hidden past. That day was coming soon. I could feel it approaching like a distant storm, inevitable and ominous. And when it came, I would be ready. Not because I wanted to be, but because this was my duty, the role I had accepted when I chose to become a keeper of secrets. The Emperor forbade his Custodes to see what lay in Archive Null, but he had ensured that someone would see, someone would know, someone would preserve the truth even as it was buried. That someone was me. And soon, very soon, I would fulfill that terrible responsibility. Chapter 7. The Final Documentation. The summons came on a cold morning in my 403rd year of service. I was working in Sub-Level 8, carefully transcribing a newly discovered account of the heresy from a remembrancer who had been on Istvan III when the bombardment began, when Shield Captain Valdor appeared beside me without sound or warning. "It is time," he said simply. "The prisoner has died. You have 7 days to complete your documentation before we seal Archive Null permanently." I had known this moment was coming. I had prepared for it across decades, but the reality of it still struck me with unexpected force. Somewhere beneath my feet, in the deepest places of the Imperial Palace, the last of Cardane's species had ceased to exist. Humanity was now truly alone in claiming Terra as its birthright. I gathered my equipment, data slates for recording, specialized instruments for measuring residual energy signatures, protective gear against whatever forces might still linger in the containment cells. I notified the Hall of Remembrance that I would be on special assignment for the next week. Then I followed Shield Captain Valdor down into the depths. The journey took hours, descending through layers of the palace I had walked once before. But this time, the way was different. Doors that had been sealed were now open. Wards that had blazed with power were dark and cold. The infrastructure of containment was being systematically disabled, now that its purpose had ended. We passed Sister Severine at one of the checkpoints. She stood at attention as we approached, and for the first time since I had met her, she removed her skull helm. Her face was ancient beyond measure, scarred not by physical damage, but by centuries of exposure to the null field that was her gift and curse. Her eyes were colorless, drained of pigment by her abilities. She made a series of signs in battle cant, and Shield Captain Valdor translated. "She says the vigil is ended. The duty is fulfilled. The threat has passed into memory. She asks that you honor what was guarded here, even as you ensure it remains hidden." I nodded, not trusting my voice to speak. Sister Severine replaced her helm and stepped aside, allowing us to pass. The descent continued. At sub-level 50, we reached the passage I remembered, carved into bedrock, spiraling down into darkness. But now lights had been installed, powered by portable generators that hummed with barely contained energy. A team of tech priests was working on the ancient mechanisms, documenting their construction before they were dismantled. "You have 1 week," Shield Captain Valdor reminded me. "After that, this entire section will be collapsed, the passage sealed with void shields and adamantium barriers, the location erased from all maps and records except those held by the Captain General himself. No one will come here again for as long as the Imperium endures." At the bottom of the passage, the massive door stood open. The dead Custodians I remembered had been removed, their armor taken for honorable disposal. Their long vigil finally ended. The doorway gaped like a mouth, no longer guarded by wards or locks. Beyond it lay Archive Null. I stepped through, and despite all my preparations, despite knowing what to expect, I gasped at what I saw. The chamber was vast, larger than cathedrals, its walls and ceiling lost in darkness beyond the range of the glow lamps. But everywhere I looked, there were signs of incredible technology. Force field generators of designs I had never seen, psychic amplifiers that looked more like artwork than machinery, containment cells that seemed to fold space itself into impossible configurations. And at the center of it all, in a chamber within a chamber, was the place where Cardane had been held. The containment field was down now, its generators cold. Inside was nothing. Just an empty space, perhaps 10 meters on each side, its walls covered with frost that sparkled in the lamplight. But the emptiness wasn't quite complete. I could still feel something, a residual presence like the warmth lingering in a room after someone has left, or the echo of a voice after words have ended. I set up my equipment and began to work. The first task was documentation, recording every detail of the containment system, measuring and analyzing and preserving knowledge of how the Emperor had built a prison for something that wasn't quite physical, wasn't quite psychic, but somehow both and neither. The technology was incredible, drawing on principles from the dark age of technology, but adapted in ways that suggested the Emperor's personal genius. Force fields that worked in multiple dimensions simultaneously, psychic dampeners that didn't just suppress warp energy, but transformed it into something inert. Physical barriers that were somehow also conceptual, preventing not just movement but thought, intention, the ability to affect reality through will alone, layer upon layer of redundant systems, each one capable of holding Custodians alone but working in concert to create something absolute. The Emperor had built this to last eternally, to require no maintenance, to function even if the entire palace fell around it. And it had worked. For 10,000 years it had worked. Not until entropy itself had worn down, the prisoner had the containment shown any sign of failing. I worked through the first day and night without stopping, driven by an urgency I couldn't quite name. I measured and recorded and analyzed, filling data slates with information that perhaps no one but me would ever read. This was it. The final account of humanity's darkest secret, the complete record of what the Emperor had hidden. On the second day, I began to find artifacts, objects that Custodians' people had made, sealed in stasis fields within the containment chamber, a crystal that refracted light in ways that shouldn't have been possible, creating colors I had no names for, a tool whose purpose I couldn't determine, covered in markings that shifted and changed when I tried to read them, a fragment of what might have been writing, etched into a material that was somehow both stone and metal and neither. I documented each one carefully, then watched as tech priests sealed them in new containment vessels. They would be stored separately, scattered across different secure locations throughout the palace, ensuring that even if one was discovered, the others would remain hidden. On the third day, I examined the walls of the innermost chamber. Here, faintly, were marks that Custodians had made during its long imprisonment. Not words exactly, but concepts expressed in visual form. Mathematics and poetry and philosophy all somehow present simultaneously in single symbols. I spent hours trying to understand them, to extract meaning from these last communications from a dying species. Some were expressions of grief, I thought, or perhaps anger. Others seemed almost peaceful, accepting. There were memories recorded there, visions of crystal cities and floating gardens, of Custodians' people in their prime, before humanity had turned against them. And there was a message, repeated over and over in different forms, like a mantra or a prayer. We tried to help. We meant well. Remember us kindly, if you remember us at all. I made precise recordings of these marks, though I knew they would be encrypted and sealed away with the other documentation. Future generations would not see them unless some crisis demanded that Archive Null's secrets be revealed. And perhaps that was right. Perhaps Custodians' plea for kind remembrance was better served by being forgotten entirely than by being remembered as a threat that had needed containment. On the fourth day, Shield Captain Valdor returned with news. The Captain General has reviewed your preliminary reports. He is satisfied with your work, but he asks that you also document your own perspective. Not just the facts of the containment, but what you believe it means. What lessons should be preserved for those who might read this account in the distant future? So I wrote, not the dry technical language of official reports, but something more personal. I wrote about my journey to Archive Null, about meeting Custodians, about the weight of carrying this secret for a century. I wrote about the Emperor's choice to hide rather than reveal, to protect humanity's self-image even at the cost of truth. I wrote about the difficulty of knowing that my entire civilization was built on lies I helped maintain, about understanding why those lies were necessary, while still feeling the moral weight of participating in them, about the lonely burden of being one of the few who knew what really lay in humanity's past. And I wrote about Custodians itself, not as a threat or a prisoner, but as the last representative of a species that had tried to help us and been destroyed for it. I tried to be fair, to acknowledge that we only had its word about the nature of that ancient conflict, that perhaps there were complications and contexts we didn't understand. But I also acknowledged the uncomfortable truth that humanity had committed genocide against a more advanced species and then erased all evidence of their existence, that our claim to moral superiority was compromised by actions we no longer remembered, that the Emperor had hidden this truth not because it was dangerous to know, but because knowing it would complicate the simple story the Imperium needed to believe. On the 5th day, I completed my technical documentation and began the process of encrypting everything according to the Captain General's specifications. The files would be sealed with genetic locks keyed to the bloodline of the Custodes leadership, accessible only by direct order and only in circumstances where the knowledge was judged necessary. On the 6th day, tech priests began the process of dismantling the containment systems. Carefully, reverently, they disconnected the power feeds and deactivated the force fields and prepared the massive machinery for removal. Some of it would be destroyed, some would be repurposed for other uses, its origins forgotten. None of it would remain here. I watched the dismantling with mixed feelings. This place had been archive null for 10,000 years, a secret within secrets. The Emperor's most carefully guarded truth. Soon it would be just another sealed chamber in the deep places of the palace, unremarkable and forgotten. On the 7th day, Shield Captain Valdor escorted me back to the surface. We climbed the spiral passage in silence, and behind us, I could hear the rumble of controlled collapse as the tech priests brought down the tunnel, sealing archive null forever. At the final checkpoint, Sister Severine waited. She had been relieved of her vigil and was preparing to return to whatever other duties the Sisters of Silence assigned her. When I passed, she reached out and touched my shoulder, the first time she had made any physical contact. She made one final sign, and Shield Captain Valdor translated. "She says you served well. She says the dead will rest easier, knowing their story was preserved, even if it must remain hidden. She says you should take pride in what you've done, even though no one will ever thank you for it." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Sister Severine released my shoulder and walked away into the shadows, disappearing as silently as her kind always did. Shield Captain Valdor brought me back to the Hall of Remembrance. At the entrance, he paused. "Your service in this matter is complete. The documentation is sealed. The secret is kept. You will not be called upon for this duty again. You may resume your normal work." "What happens now?" I asked. "To the documentation, to the knowledge of what was there. It will be preserved," Shield Captain Valdor said, "in the deepest vaults of the Custodes' own archives, guarded as carefully as the Emperor himself. Perhaps someday, centuries or millennia from now, circumstances will arise that require its revelation, or perhaps it will remain sealed until the Imperium falls and all our secrets are scattered to the void. Either way, the truth is preserved. That was your task. You have fulfilled it." He turned to leave, then paused and looked back at me. The Emperor chose to hide this truth because he believed humanity needed simple stories to remain united. The Custodes maintain that choice because we trust in his wisdom. But we also maintain the full truth, hidden but not destroyed, because we understand that circumstances change. What is necessary to hide today may be necessary to reveal tomorrow. You have helped ensure that when that tomorrow comes, if it comes, the truth will be available. That is no small service. Then he was gone, and I was alone in the Hall of Remembrance, surrounded by the carefully curated history of 10,000 years of human empire. I returned to my duties. I continued my work. I trained new historitors and catalogued documents and participated in the endless, necessary labor of preserving and shaping the past. But something had changed. The weight I had carried was different now. Not lighter exactly, but more settled. I had completed the task I had been set. I had documented the truth and ensured its preservation. What happened to that truth now was no longer my responsibility. I could finally rest. Chapter 8. Legacy of Silence. My service to the Hall of Remembrance continued for another 2 centuries after the sealing of Archive Null. By the end, I was the most senior historitor in the palace, my name associated with hundreds of major documentation projects. My expertise sought by everyone from administratum officials to visiting inquisitors who needed access to obscure historical records. None of them knew about my most important work. None suspected that the frail old man who helped them navigate the archives had once stood in the deepest place beneath the throne and documented humanity's darkest secret. That anonymity was part of the burden. To do such significant work and receive no recognition for it. To carry knowledge that set you apart from everyone around you while pretending to be exactly the same. But I had learned to accept it. It was the price of serving truth at the highest level. You became invisible. a guardian whose very existence had to remain unknown. As I aged beyond even what aggressive rejuvenate could sustain, I began to think about legacy, not the kind of legacy most people contemplated: children, wealth, fame, works that would outlive them. My legacy was different, stranger, more complicated. I had trained 17 historitors who went on to senior positions throughout the imperial administration. They carried with them the lessons I had taught about the nature of knowledge, about the difference between truth and useful truth, about understanding that history serves purposes beyond mere accuracy. They would pass those lessons to their own students, and so on through generations. I had also, in careful and oblique ways, established protocols, methods for how to handle discoveries that contradicted official narratives, procedures for determining when truth needed to be suppressed versus when it could be revealed, a framework for thinking about the relationship between knowledge and power that acknowledged the complexity of both without surrendering to complete cynicism. These protocols were not written down in any single document. They were scattered across training materials and procedural guidelines and informal traditions, invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for, but clear to those who had been taught to see. Future generations of historitors would follow these protocols without necessarily understanding their full significance. And of course, there was the sealed documentation of Archive Null itself, locked away in the Custodes' deepest vaults. My final service to the Imperium, the complete record of what the Emperor had forbidden his most trusted servants to see. I thought often about whether I had made the right choices. Should I have exposed the truth about Custodians when I first learned it? Should I have defied the Custodians and the Captain General and insisted that humanity deserved to know its real history, regardless of the consequences? I didn't think so. Not because I believed truth was unimportant, but because I had learned through long experience that truth without context is often more harmful than useful. The truth about Custodians' species, that humanity had committed genocide against beings who tried to help us, was a truth that would have shattered the ideological foundations of the Imperium. It would have raised questions about humanity's inherent righteousness, about the Emperor's wisdom, about whether our crusade to dominate the galaxy was justified. Those questions might have led to valuable philosophical growth if asked in a stable, peaceful civilization. But in the endless war of the 41st millennium, they would more likely have led to fracture, doubt, and collapse. The Imperium survived through faith. Faith that humanity was special, that our suffering gave us the right to rule, that the Emperor's vision was fundamentally correct. Removing that faith by exposing its foundations as built on genocide would have been like removing the keystone from an arch. The whole structure would have come down. So I had made the choice the Emperor himself had made 10,000 years earlier. Preserve the lie because the lie served humanity better than the truth. Maintain the secret because the secret kept us safe from ourselves. Was that the right choice? I still didn't know, but it was the choice I had made, and I would stand by it to the end of my days. In my final years, I received one last visit from Shield Captain Valdor. He came to my quarters in the Historitor's residence, a simple room I had occupied for 3 centuries, its walls lined with books and data slates, and the accumulated detritus of a long life spent in service to knowledge. He seemed unchanged, though centuries had passed since our first meeting. The Custodes aged slowly, if at all, maintained by technologies and genetic modifications that kept them forever in their prime. He would likely serve for millennia yet, while I was approaching the end of what rejuvenate could sustain. "I bring news," he said without preamble. "The archives where your documentation is stored have been updated with additional security. New genetic locks, new encryptions, new protocols for access. This was done by order of the Captain General himself, who wished to ensure that your work would survive as long as the Imperium endures." "Thank you," I said, meaning it. My final service would not be forgotten, even if no one but the Custodes would remember who had performed it. Shield Captain Valdor nodded, then surprised me by sitting, an informal gesture I had never seen from one of the 10,000. He removed his helm, revealing a face that was stern but not unkind, bearing the weight of 10,000 years of service with quiet dignity. "You should know," he said, speaking in a tone I had never heard from him before, almost conversational, "that you are not the first to bear this particular burden. Others have discovered Archive Null over the millennia, some by accident, some through research like yours. Most were silenced permanently. A few, like you, proved capable of carrying the knowledge without being destroyed by it. How many? I asked. How many have known? 7, including yourself. 7 historitors across 10,000 years who learned what the Emperor hid and chose to keep it hidden. Your documentation will be added to theirs, creating a complete record maintained by different perspectives across vast spans of time. When the end comes, when circumstances finally demand that the truth be revealed, or when the Imperium falls and all secrets are scattered, this combined record will provide complete context. He paused, studying my face with those ancient, knowing eyes. You've wondered whether you made the right choice, whether silence was cowardice or wisdom. I cannot answer that for you, but I can tell you that every one of your predecessors struggled with the same question, and everyone ultimately concluded that serving humanity's survival was more important than satisfying their need for moral clarity. Whether that makes them wise or merely pragmatic is a question each of us must answer for ourselves. What do you think? I asked. You've guarded the Emperor's secrets for 10,000 years. Do you believe he was right to hide what he did? Right to let humanity believe lies rather than face uncomfortable truths? Shield Captain Valdor was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. The Emperor, he finally said, is the greatest being humanity has ever produced. His wisdom exceeds ours in every dimension, but he is not infallible. He makes mistakes. He miscalculates. The heresy proved that. If he could misjudge his own son so catastrophically, then his other decisions must also be subject to question. But, and here his voice became firm, the Emperor also understands humanity in ways we cannot fully grasp. He sees patterns across millennia where we see only years. He comprehends the full weight of human nature, our potential and our limitations. When he chooses to hide truth, it is not from fear or shame, but from calculated understanding of what humanity can bear. So, yes, I believe he was right to seal Archive null, not because the truth is inherently dangerous, but because releasing it at the wrong time, in the wrong context, to a humanity not prepared to receive it, would have done more harm than good. And I believe you were right to maintain that choice, to add your documentation to the hidden record rather than expose it prematurely. He stood, replacing his helm, becoming once again the remote, perfect warrior I had first met centuries ago. You have served well, Historitor. When your time comes, when you pass into the care of the Emperor's peace, know that your name is recorded in places more secure than any archive. The Custodes remember those who help us guard humanity's most dangerous truths. You will not be forgotten by us, even if the rest of the Imperium never knows what you did. After he left, I sat in my quarters and thought about his words. I thought about the 6 other Historitors who had walked the same path, who had made the same choices, who had carried the same burden. I wondered what they had been like, whether they had struggled as I had, whether they had found peace with their decisions. I would never know. Their identities were as hidden as my work would be. We were anonymous guardians, nameless servants of a truth that had to remain secret. But we had served. That was what mattered. Not recognition or reward, but the knowledge that we had done what was necessary to protect humanity from knowledge it couldn't handle. We had been strong enough to bear the weight so others wouldn't have to. In my final months, I began writing this account, not the official documentation sealed in the Custodes vaults, but a personal narrative, a record of what it had been like to discover Archive null and to choose silence over exposure. I wrote knowing that this account too would be sealed away, would become part of the hidden record, maintained for some distant future when circumstances might finally demand revelation. I wrote it for my successor, whoever they might be, for the next Historitor who would discover what I had discovered, who would face the same choices and carry the same burden. I wanted them to know they weren't alone, that others had walked this path before them, that the struggle was real but manageable. That service to truth sometimes meant hiding it rather than revealing it. I wrote about meeting Custodians, about understanding what the Emperor had hidden, about the weight of carrying that knowledge through centuries of service. I wrote about the dreams that never entirely stopped, about the isolation of knowing what no one else could be told, about the slow acceptance that some truths serve humanity better by remaining unknown. And I wrote about the strange pride I felt, even through all the doubt and struggle. Pride in having been trusted with such a significant secret. Pride in having proven capable of carrying it without breaking. Pride in having contributed, in my small way, to the preservation of the Imperium that had given my life purpose and meaning. The Emperor forbade his Custodes to see what lay in Archive null, because he understood that even his most loyal, most powerful servants had limits to what they could know without being changed by it. He understood that some truths are so dangerous, so destabilizing, that they must be kept from everyone except a very few who can bear them without being destroyed. He was one of those few, not because I was stronger or wiser than others, but because circumstances and genetics and pure chance had put me in the right place at the right time to serve in this way. And I had served faithfully, silently for centuries. Now my service was ending. My body was failing despite rejuvenate. My mind beginning to show signs of the fog that eventually claims even the most carefully maintained humans. Soon I would die, and another Historitor would take my place in the Hall of Remembrance, knowing nothing of what I had done or what I had learned. That was how it should be. That was how it had to be. The burden of Archive Null would pass to the next generation of Guardians. The Custodes who would watch the sealed documentation, the Captain General who held ultimate responsibility for deciding if and when it should ever be revealed, and perhaps someday another Historitor who would discover what the Emperor had forbidden and make the same choice I had made. The weight would continue to be carried, the truth would continue to be preserved, and humanity would continue forward, protected by secrets we kept from ourselves, guarded by those willing to bear the burden of knowledge too dangerous to share. This is my final account, my last testimony as one who saw what the Emperor forbade his Custodes to see. I write it not as a confession or a justification, but simply as a record. One more voice added to the hidden archive. One more perspective on the difficult choices we make to protect humanity from itself. The secret will outlive me. The truth will endure, hidden but not lost. And someday, perhaps, when humanity is finally ready, when we are strong enough and wise enough and mature enough to face the full complexity of our history without the security of comforting lies, then these documents will be unsealed. Then the Emperor's most carefully guarded secret will finally be revealed. Then humanity will learn what was forbidden and why, and perhaps understand that sometimes the greatest service is silence, and the deepest wisdom is knowing when truth must be hidden for the greater good. Until that day comes, we wait, we watch, we guard the darkness beneath the throne, and we remember what others are not allowed to. No, recorded in the 602nd year of my service, Historitor Valdor Kesh, may the Emperor forgive what I have kept hidden, may humanity endure long enough to finally face its truth.